Well, hey guys, as Josh said, my name is Keith. I'm lead pastor here at Resonate Church, and I'm incredibly excited to be here with you guys today. And before we go any further, I want to real quick shout out to those of us who are joining, or those of you who are joining us on video. I want to just say we love you guys over at the University of Idaho, at Central Washington. So yeah, go Vandals. Go Wildcats, and of course, go Cougs. We're excited that all of this is happening in terms of this series that we're engaging in, and I'm so excited about this. I've been looking forward to this. I've been just kind of waiting till we get to this series because I love stories. I don't know if you love stories, but I love this conflict that we see and the characters that are there. I love how it all plays out, and we begin to see people who are in their struggles and in their triumphs. I love seeing how in all of this, it is so real in terms of the way that we get communicated with. And so if someone was to tell me just an objective truth, like this is true, then it just doesn't really land in my heart. And I go back to even when I was young as a kid, I think back to some of the most meaningful things were tied to stories, were tied to understanding and being in the moment. And these are the things that are most meaningful. And I don't know if you can kind of relate back to some of the most meaningful things that you learned being tied, not to just someone telling you something was true, but even more than that, from someone telling you a story and kind of getting the whole kind of picture of what is going on that lands as truth deeply in our hearts. And I don't think this is on accident. I think that we are created as people who love story, as people who see this truth as always connected to life, as see something that is not just out there, but is something that's integrated. And so all throughout history, the truths have been told through stories. All throughout your history, many of the truths that you connect to your story are said in the story, or in the context of how you see the world and how you've heard about the world. And throughout history, the most significant realities of God have been told through stories and have been retold. And through most of the period of history that we've seen lived out, only a small part of it has been written down. And so almost all of our history is oral history, and specifically when it comes to the Bible, when we begin to understand that these are stories. And so tonight I want to talk to you about an ordinary guy. I want to tell you the story of a guy who, by all accounts, was an ordinary guy until God called him to live an extraordinary life. I want to tell you a story of a man that God chose to form the first covenant he would form with someone. I want to tell you the story of a man from which two people groups are linked to. I want to tell you a story about a man who three religions see as their founding father. I want to tell you the story of Abraham. The story of Abraham is a foundational story. In fact, many of the stories that we'll look at, many of the things that will kind of that people hear and understand about the Bible are connected back to the understanding of Abraham as a man of faith and a man who understood God. And this is amazing as we get to see and look at how God gives Abraham a promise and a command. And Abraham begins to live out this promise, begins to be faithful to that command. And now we get to enjoy, it says the Bible, that all the people of the world are blessed. And you and I are connected to this story directly because we are people who are blessed by the life of Abraham. And I want you to understand what an extraordinary life of an ordinary man actually looks like. Because I think there's something for you and for I to connect to in this. That there's a truth that I hope lands deeply in your heart. We've been praying for you that this truth lands deeply in your heart as you begin to understand that this story is not just a story, but it's the story and tells about the God and how that God can relate to your story. It starts in Genesis 12. In Genesis 12, we have this moment where Abraham kind of arrives on the scene. In the first verse of chapter 12, it says this: "The Lord said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse whoever curses, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the people on earth, that is you and me, will be blessed through you. But the requirement, this promise comes with this command, and this command is to go. And so this is exactly what Abraham does. Abraham is about 75 years old at this point, and Abraham packs up all of his earthly possessions, all the people related to his tribe, all the things that he owned, his livestock, everything. And he becomes a nomad. And he goes from the land that they had inhabited there in Haran, and they go south. He goes south for a few years, and he kind of migrates, and he's kind of a nomad living around there. But there becomes a drought, and he has to go further south. And he ends up in the country in the land of Egypt. In the land of Egypt, he sees these people and questions whether or not they are righteous people. And so as he enters into this land, he understands there's a reality that he must deal with. And the reality is that he has a hot wife. And this hot wife, he says to his wife, he says, listen, you are very beautiful. And all of these people are going to want to have you. And if they find out that I'm your husband, here's the thing. This is gonna go really badly for me because they're gonna kill me to get to you, right? And so he tells his wife Sarai, he says, I need you to say that you are my sister. Now, this is not exactly a lie because if you begin to look at it, he's kind of his half-sister. But really the primary relationship, I know this is get weird, right? And you might say, this is getting good now, okay? This is kind of strange. But this is the reality. So he says, I have this wife who is very desirable. She is very beautiful. And so if you will tell them that I'm your brother, then they'll say, hey, and they'll treat me well, right? Because they want to get in good with you, right? And so this is this whole thing that's happening here. And so this is indeed how Pharaoh treats Abraham. So he treats Abraham very well on behalf of Sarah. But then what happens is God doesn't let Abraham live out the lie. And what happens is he begins to have these plagues and these judgment that happens on the people of Egypt and specifically in Pharaoh. And Pharaoh comes to Abraham and says, hey man, you weren't straight with me. This is your wife, and you said he was your sister, so here's what I need you to do. Take your stuff and just go, because I don't want to be judged, because there's something unique about you. You see, in this moment, Abraham is blessed amazingly as he leaves his country, and he begins to be very rich. The second thing he's blessed is he sees God's provision in protecting him in this moment, even when he is dubious and even as he's kind of shady in telling this lie. So he journeys back up north, he and his nephew Lot. They go to a place, the Valley of Jordan, and this is a place that is very fertile, but it's not fertile enough to be able to kind of sustain both of these tribes of people. And so he says to Lot, you go this, or you pick a way, and whichever way you go, I'm going to go the other way. As he goes the other way, he lands in the land of where Abimelech is king. He does the same thing. He takes and he says, listen, I'm not sure if these people are righteous people, and so here's what I need you to do. Just like we fooled the Egyptians, I need you to fool these people as well. I need you to tell them that you're my sister. And so this is exactly what she does. She does the same kind of thing. However, God intercepts the lie, and he goes to Abimelech and says, hey man, I need you to know that this is not his sister, but this is Abraham's wife, okay? And you don't need to touch her. In fact, already, if you don't make amends in this situation, I'm going to take in your entire country and I'm going to make them barren, which will end this country in a single generation, right? And so Abimelech goes to Abraham and says, hey, you weren't straight with me. And in fact, you lied, but God told me. And so here's what I need you to do. I need you to know that I haven't done anything. And I want you to take this gift to make sure that we're cool. And you can go and you can live anywhere in this land, just as long as our country doesn't die because of what we've done in innocence. And so again, God provides for Abraham, and he provides this way for him to get out of this situation. He protects him. And throughout this, he begins to hear from the Lord. In chapter 15, it says this: after the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, it says, do not be afraid, Abram, For I am your shield, your very great reward. He goes back to this promise that somehow he's going to be numerous. Somehow he's going to have this great reward from God. But Abraham begins to recognize a significant reality, and that is this: that Abraham and his wife Sarah are very old and are childless. That the line in his heritage will die with him. And this is what he says. But Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abraham said, "You have given me no children, so a servant of my household will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." And he took him outside and he says, "Look up at the sky, count the stars, if you can indeed count them." He said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And there's an important part that happens next. It says this: Abraham actually believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. God credited it to Abraham as righteousness. This is an amazing thing. And so what happens is God says, here's the thing: I was not kidding when I said I was going to bless you, and I'm going to make your offspring numerous as the stars. But you're old, and I've got to do this. And what we begin to see is that Abraham begins to question God's timing. And he tells Sarah, this is the promise that God's given. And Sarah doesn't believe him and says, here's the thing, I'm kind of old. I'm like really old. And somehow the Egyptians still think I'm beautiful, right? So this is how this is working. And I need you to know that the pressure to bear you a son is overwhelming. So I need to do something about this. And I need for you to sleep with my servant Hagar, unfortunately named Hagar, right? Hagar, and so that your line will go on throughout and you will have this heir. And so Abraham, he sleeps with his wife's servant, and he bears a son named Ishmael. Ishmael is the father of the Arab race. And what we begin to see is Abraham not believing in God's provision. God said, here's what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do. Here's how you can trust in me to carry on your story. But he doesn't trust, and instead he takes matters into his own hand. Then God comes back to Abraham and says, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have a son. Let me get a little bit more specific, Abraham. You're going to have a son with your wife, Sarah. And I need you to know that this is possible. And it is such an impossible thing. He says, will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90 and me 100 years old? How is this possible, God? And he begins to laugh. And when Sarah hears about this, she begins to laugh too. The idea of them bearing a child at this age is completely unthinkable for her. And she begins to say, you can't be serious, God. And one of the funniest things, she begins to have this interaction with the Lord, and the Lord said, why did you laugh? And Sarah says, I didn't laugh. And the Lord simply just says, yes, you did. You did laugh. Just so we're clear on this point, right? And here's the thing. She begins to doubt the Lord. And so here's the reality. He says, this is what you're needing to do. I want you to name your child Isaac, because Isaac means laughter. You laughed at how outlandish it would be for you to bear a child at the age of 90 and your husband at the age of 100. As we begin to see, this happens. And laughter enters into their world. Indeed, Sarah gives birth to Isaac. And how amazing must this have been? Here before your eyes, you've seen this ordinary guy begin to live out this extraordinary story as he leaves his country, as he begins to journey around, as he begins to be a very wealthy man. But the one thing that God promised him is the one thing that he didn't have until Isaac arrived on the scene. An heir from he and his wife. And every day, what must it have been like to be able to look at the provision of God, to look at the promise that God gave him 25 years before. Now at 100, he sees his son. He sees Isaac. Laughter. What joy must have filled their household to know that God was faithful. And then we arrive at chapter 22. Chapter 22 may be the culmination of all this, the climax of this story. You see, in chapter 22, we begin to see something radically change. It says this in verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain. I will show you. I think we just need to stop there. Can you imagine hearing the voice of the Lord, the same voice of the Lord who says, here's the promise that you're to have. Here's this idea, here's this thing that I'm going to provide for you. And hear that very same of the voice of the Lord saying this, I want you to take and I want you to kill your son. How mind-blowing must that have been? And here's what Abraham did. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Can you imagine? He's probably 10 years old at this point. He begins to recognize what's going on. Can you imagine hearing your son say, Dad, where's the sacrifice? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Think of that moment. You're looking at the provision, the miracle child there on the altar. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on that mountain of the Lord it will be provided. This story was a story that would have been told over and over, the details specific in the way that it was communicated, so that no detail got out of place and they knew exactly what this had been about. And this last part of the story, as they begin to see this whole process from God's promise in chapter 12 all the way to chapter 22, when Abraham was tested and found faithful before God. And all of that leads to a clear picture, a picture that I need you to hear, a picture that was very clear to Abraham. It is this. It says this, that place was called the Lord will provide. And to this day, it says, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. And it doesn't necessarily mean that physical place was where God provided. But it means this was the place that God revealed himself so clearly in his character as one who provides. In fact, if you take that and you kind of look at the Hebrew, the original language this is written in, the word says it's Jehovah and the word is Jireh. And this word Jireh is this word for seeing. And so the Lord will see in the midst of all of the other gods that were in this land, these gods who needed to be appeased, the one true God whom Abraham worshiped revealed himself as the God that wasn't just a petty God that needed to be appeased by humans, but a God who was there engaged in his people, a God who had formed a covenant and said, I see you. I am there. I am in your story. I am not disengaged, but I'm engaged with your life and what you're about. And this is a big deal, that God is a God whose character is to provide. That God would say, do this, but the overwhelming reality that Abraham comes out of there with is this understanding. He says, this is the thing that I get from all of this, that the characteristic of God, at the very heart of who God is a God that provides. What God requires, he provides. And this is incredibly important, because I could stand up here and say to you, I want you to know the God that you serve, the God that you worship, the God that you sing songs to. And I need you to know that this is a God that provides. And throughout history, this might have been something that's like, yeah, okay, I get that. But what this has done throughout all of history is this cements this idea that God is not a God who is disengaged, but a God who provides, a God who is faithful to us. And upon this foundation of God who provides and a God who is faithful, it reveals all of who God is. And this is what Abraham understood. You see, I believe Abraham goes into this experience. He hears God say, your miracle child, your child of laughter, that this thing that you didn't believe me for, but I provided to you to fulfill this promise in your life. This child is a child that you need to sacrifice. And as Abraham hears this, throughout the story, throughout that 10 chapters that have happened before, and that 25 years that God has established this promise all the way till now, over and over, what God has repeatedly done is say to Abraham, I will provide. I will provide. And I believe that Abraham, when he took that morning and went out to the mountain of Moriah, he knew that somehow God wouldn't let him down. And here's how I know, just really quick. We see, and I didn't hit on this, but we see Abraham negotiating with God about Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, this town that was destroyed. God tells Abraham he's going to destroy the town, and Abraham begins to negotiate with God. Again, there's not a whole lot of history of God, so he just says, let me see if I can ask a little bit more from him. So he says to God, he says, hold it, if there's 50 righteous people, would you spare that town? And God says, yes, I'll spare it if there's 50. Now, Abraham, great negotiator, he gets God all the way down to 10 people, right? And so at 10 people, he says, if there's 10 people, will you allow this town to be saved? So what we see is a pattern of Abraham being able to say, I'm going to go to God and ask for something. Now, in this moment, as he begins to see all of this, why doesn't he ask God for something different? God, does it have to be this child? How about if I sacrifice one of my servants? How about if I sacrifice something else just to show you how faithful I am? But we don't see any of that. Also in this, we begin to see him use pluralistic language when he says, stay here to his servant, stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. And then when Isaac asks, where's the sacrifice? What does he say? God himself will provide. Now, I think that maybe Abraham didn't know exactly how God was going to do it. I don't know if he knew exactly the way that God was going to do this, but I think that Abraham knew that God was not going to fail him, because the character of God was a God of provision. And this is incredibly important for us, because you and I need to understand who God is. Not just in a way that looks like some idea about God, but a fundamental understanding of the nature of God. I want you to, through these stories, have your faith built because you begin to know this is the characteristic of God. It is key for us when we begin to look at this idea that God is a God who provides. It is the foundation for all the other stories. Now, if you know some of the stories of the Old Testament, they all relate back to this story that you see Moses taking the Israelites from Egypt into or out of Egypt and through the Red Sea, and all these plagues happen, right? This crazy thing. But this is built on God is a God who's going to provide. You see David and Goliath. You see David as this young shepherd. And what does he say to the people? He says, here's the thing. There's no one that can stand up to the giant except for this reality. I know the character of God, and God is going to provide. And so when God said to go and slay the Philistine, he's going to figure out a way for me to do it. Built on the foundation of God's characteristic of provision. Moses knew this story. David knew this story. The people of Jericho marched around this city, or not the people of Jericho, the people of Israel marched around the city of Jericho. And God said, I'm going to give you this city. This is how I'm going to do it. You're going to yell and scream and blow some trumpets, and then the walls are going to come tumbling down, right? Crazy stuff. I need you to know that it is not from your strength, but it is from my strength, because I am the God of provision. I'm the God who provides. Over and over and over, all of these stories. I can go story after story after story. Every single one of them knew the story of Abraham. From the very beginning, when he says, have a moment. Why did they know? Think about, what does Isaac tell Esau and Jacob, his sons? There I was on the altar, and God rescued me. I was saved because God is a God of provision. This characteristic of God cemented into the heart of the people around, cemented into Abraham's heart. And what I want to tell you today is that this is a fundamental piece. That God and the characteristics of God, who God's character is, and that God is a God of provision, is a part of the equation of faith that God wants to build into you and to I. Because here's the reality. One of God's primary purposes in your life is to build your faith. One of the things that God is doing in your life is that God, right now, I don't know what your circumstances are, but I do know if you are following after Christ, He is trying to create within you a deeper, stronger faith. He wants you to be built up in your faith. And what does this look like? It looks like understanding the character of God. You see, this is where it starts. When God says, this is who I am, we begin to say, this is God's character. This is who I am. Throughout Scripture, He's saying, this is my heart. I want you to know who I am. Now, when we begin to get to know people, sometimes we don't have to have them tell us everything that they think, because we begin to understand this is who they are. This is the characteristic that they have. And this is what God wants us to understand. That He doesn't want to give us a command for everything, because He wants us to know that there are things that are just about His nature. And so we begin to operate with clarity in this world. We begin to operate with confidence in this world because God gives us His character. And when we begin to understand His character, we begin to have clarity and confidence in this world. The second thing He gives us, He begins to say, these are my ways. God gives us, this is who I am. This is my character. These are my commands. These are the things that I've done to explicitly tell you this is what I was to do. And so Abraham has God tell him specific things that he needs to do. But Abraham's faith is built on the merger between these. And when we begin to understand how we are to live and what this looks like, we have to understand that character plus commands equals confidence and clarity. That when we begin to say, here is who God is, this is what He's explicitly told us. And for us, it's much easier because He's given us His word. This is who God is. This is explicitly what He's commanded. And when we operate this is the foundations of our faith, who God is, what He's told us, and this gives us confidence, knowing that God is for us, He has our back, and it gives us clarity. I know exactly what God desires from me. And when we put these all together, it creates an incredible understanding of how our faith works. And let me shoot this kind of graphic on the screen to help you to understand how this works. Not that one. That one. This graphic, when we begin to understand the known character versus the unknown character, and the known commands versus the unknown commands, and when we begin to see how all of this works together, your faith has these two components, the character of God and the commands of God. When we begin to see a known command and a known character, at the intersection of those two realities, what you begin to have is confident clarity. And this is what Abraham had. He goes up to the mountain. He knows that somehow God is going to provide. God said specifically, here's what to do with your son, but here's who I am. And so he goes into an unknown situation with confidence and with clarity. When we begin to understand how this works, let's say that there's an unknown character, but a known command. In many of the places in our world, we have people that have heard the rules of God, but haven't gotten to know the person of God. And when that happens, we have a graceless morality. I know the commands, but I don't know the character of God. So I don't know who He is, I just know what He said. A graceless morality. And when we begin to have this graceless morality inserted into our lives, we see these commands and we shrug our shoulders because they don't motivate our hearts compared to our own desires. We just say, this is, I guess, what it means to be moral, but it doesn't compel me to live towards God because I don't have His character. I'm not a person of faith that does remarkable things because I only have the rules. When we begin to see the other side, if you have a known character, but you don't know the commands, that you have this inspired confusion, that you're somebody who says, man, I love God, but I don't really know what God has to say in my life. That I love coming to church, but I haven't gotten into God's specific revelation for my life. I don't have clarity in my life, but man, I am passionate. There's many people like that. And then there's others who aren't seeking God's character, aren't seeking God's commands, and there's hopeless confusion. And this is this grid through which we begin to say, how do we begin to have people that are built in their faith? And what does this look like? How is this working? Because Abraham, he becomes the father of nations. This ordinary dude becomes an extraordinary man. How does that happen? How does God build your faith? What does it look like? Over and over and over. See, here's what I believe. That Abraham understood this promise. And then when he acted on faith, he began to then see God's provision, and that revealed God's faithfulness. That made him believe the promise, that allowed him to act in faith. Then he began to see God's provision, and he took a bigger step. And this is this loop, and this is kind of what this looks like. This is the faithful loop. That there is this promise that's given to Abraham. That there's this faith step that he takes. The first faith step, leave your country. Allow Lot to have the preferred place to grow his flocks and his herds. And then you begin to see God's provision, and God proves Himself as faithful. The faithful loop is the way that God builds our faith. Abraham didn't just, in chapter 12, he didn't have a son, and God said, hey, I need you to sacrifice your son. I don't believe that God would have done that in chapter 12. It took 25 years. It took 10 chapters of God bringing him on this loop, saying, take a step. I've given you a promise. If you'll take a step, I'll meet you with provision and prove myself faithful. You take a step, be faithful. I'll prove myself and being faithful back to you. And this is what happens over and over and over. The faithful loop. This faithful loop is the same thing that happens in your life. Because we are called to go from ordinary people to remarkable people. And this doesn't just happen if we just hear something that's this outrageous command of God. In fact, some of you hear these things that God calls you to do and you're like, there's no way I can do this. But here's what I believe is the call for you and the call for me is for us to be people who live remarkable lives. Not people who just fade into the scenery in the world around us, in the culture around us, but people who stand out. And people who stand out, people who have remarkable lives, don't just get there all of a sudden one day. It is a trajectory of the faithful loop. Of you saying, I'm going to take a step. And God saying, I'm going to provide for you. And you beginning to say, I believe in God's provision. I believe the character of God is to provide for me. And he proves himself faithful. And that allows you to take a bigger step and a bigger step and a bigger step and a bigger step because of this cycle over and over and over. And as Abraham looks and said, when I left my country, you provided for me. When I went into Egypt, you protected me. When I went to this place where there was some conflict between my family, you allowed me to expand my influence and my resources. When I went to Abimelech, you allowed me to be protected and provided for. When you said that you were going to bless me and extend my heirs like the stars, you provided the sun. And so when I get to a place where I have the knife in my hand and I stand over my son, here's what I've been through over and over and over. I've seen that you are a God who provides, and I believe that you're faithful, and it's very easy. I won't use that word. It is not ever very easy, but it is doable for me to say, God, I'm going to take your miracle child to a place, and I don't know what you're going to do, but I know that you're going to provide. Here's your command. Here's your character. I'm going to take this loop, and I know that you're going to do something. This is the pattern of our lives, and this is what I'm calling you to do. This is what I want from us. People say sometimes, Keith, how did you get to a place where you came from a small town in Texas to the Palouse and starting a church from nothing? Man, that must have been a big deal. Man, that must have been a great step of faith. It's simply the faithful loop. We didn't get here in one step. It was first okay, God, I'll move out Texas. I'll move to another place. I'll be faithful in saying, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. All these moments. We're in that room because it's the only room we can afford in town. And we begin to think, I don't know if this is going to work, but you've said you've called us to do this. You've said to us, you've given us clarity in your commands. And I know that this is your desire to do this. And so we're going to take this step of faith. And these little steps of faith are the things that are key for our everyday life. Over and over and over until this begins to be the rhythm where God is proving himself faithful over and over and over. One of my favorite stories is a guy named George Mueller. You see, this is not just in biblical times. This is for us. And George Mueller was a man of great faith. George Mueller would walk the streets of London, and as he began to see these orphan children, he said, someone needs to do something about it. I see that this is this command of God for the orphans. I see the character of God to provide. So God, I'm just going to call upon you to do what you do. And so he began to pray for a building. He began to pray for the resources, and he began to build these schools and these orphanages all over England. One story communicates it really well. It says this: the children are dressed and ready for school, but there's no food for them to eat. The house mother of the orphanage, she informed George Mueller. George asked her to take the 300 children into the dining room and have them sit at the tables. He thanked God for the food and waited. Can you imagine this? They're sitting at empty tables. Thank you, Lord, for this food. And they're like, this dude has lost his mind. There's no food here. George knew that God would provide the food for the children as he always did. And within minutes, a baker knocked on the door. Mr. Mueller, he said, last night I couldn't sleep. And somehow I knew that you would need bread this morning, so I got up and baked 3 batches early this morning. I'll bring it in to you. Soon there was another knock at the door. It was the milkman. His cart had broken down in front of the orphanage, and the milk would spoil by the time he got the wheel fixed. He asked George if he would like some free milk. George smiled as the milkman brought in 10 large cans of milk, just enough for 300 children. Over and over, there's story after story. And what's your story? Because I want you to be the kind of person that can say, I'm going to take this step of faith. God, I know that you said that we should date in this kind of way, that this is the way, and I know that you're a God who provides, and so I'm going to do this right. I'm not going to take matters into my own hands and try to force this relationship. God, what should I do as I take this job or figure out this major? God, I know that you've given us clarity in this, but you're a God who provides. So tell me, how should I live this out? What should I do? What's my next step of faith? And simply this. This is the calling. This is the calling for you and I to be people that say, God, what is the next thing that I need you to do? What's the next step I need to take that really only you can take for me? God, I know that you're a God of provision, so I want to ask you to provide. What does this look like? And see, we get to call upon God. See, anything that I've just told you in the last 41 minutes is something that could have come from a mosque or a synagogue. See, this is what makes it Christian. That God said to Abraham, I'm going to spare your son. You don't have to sacrifice your son. But God himself said, I'm going to sacrifice my son. I ask you to sacrifice your son, but ultimately I stepped in the way and I spared your son, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to spare my son. I'm going to send my son to you. I'm going to send my son into this world so that he might be able to pay the penalty for that which separates sinful people from a holy God. And so God did the unthinkable. He sent his son. He, a God of provision, gave us a Savior so that we might be able to be redeemed to our Heavenly Father, so that we might be able to have a relationship with God, so that we might be able to access this God of provision, this character of God, this God who provides, and that we might not stand in opposition to God, but in relationship to God. And this covenant that he began with Abraham, he redeemed in his son, Jesus Christ. Incredible story. Islam, Judaism comes from this story, but Christianity completes the story with the sending of Jesus and the understanding that it is only through Jesus that we'll have access to the God who provides. And so let me conclude and just ask you, where do you need God to be the God of provision in your life? Where, maybe say it this way, where have you not let God provide for your life? What's the next thing that you need to do that you need God to actually do? Let me just ask you to bow your heads really quick. See, God's desire is to build your faith. And where does God today need to build your faith? Where does God need to reveal this characteristic of who he is to you today? What if today was a new day of faith for you? A day where you cast aside your doubts and believed that God is who he says he is, and he's done what he said he would do. that you walk in confidence and clarity instead of confusion, that you have hope where you've had doubt. Because the story of Abraham is the story that resounds in our hearts today. It reveals who he is. And so I want to ask us, how will we respond to a God who has responded to us? How will we respond to a God who said, I want to provide for you? Do not cheat God out of proving his faithfulness. Do not say, I'll take this on my own, or God, I'm going to try to figure out how I can do this on my own. It never works out. And so there's some stuff today that some of you need to pry out of your hands, and so that God can be proven faithful to you, so that you engage the faithful loop. Don't stop the loop. It's a powerful thing in your life. Allow the faithful loop to bring you deep confidence, hope, and joy. God, I ask it to be so. I ask that in this church that you would raise up remarkable people that every day take a step and say, God, I want to lean into you, to trust only you, to believe in you, to put my faith in only you. In your holy name, amen.